Hello, in this video I'm going to take you through a complete retouching workflow in Photoshop, and if you're new to Photoshop then this will be a good introduction to some of the key features within the program. We're going to take a look at using layers to build up our retouching workflow. We're also going to delve into adjustment layers and layer masking. And we're going to use these tools and commands to enhance our portrait here by retouching some of the little blemishes and messy hairs around the face. We're also going to lift the eyes and smooth out the skin a little bit. So let's get cracking. First of all, we're going to want to bring up our layers panel. And this is the most important panel within Photoshop. We'll go to Window, Layers to access the layers panel. And I'll just make it slightly smaller and bring it to the side of the screen over here. Now, I'm going to start by retouching some of these stray hairs and marks around the face here. And now I could do this to my background layer here. I could just grab the spot healing brush tool, which you'll find in the tools panel over here, and I could just start painting to remove these little marks and blemishes. But to keep my editing non-destructive, instead, I'm going to make a new empty layer by clicking the Create New Layer icon here at the very bottom of the layers panel, and this gives me a new empty layer, and in fact I'm going to rename it Spot Healing. So now we're going to get stuck in with the spot healing brush tool, which, as I say, you'll find in the tools panel over here. But before we do, let's go to the tool options at the top of the screen here, and we want to make sure this option here is checked for sample all layers. That means that we can heal on our empty layer while sampling from our background image on the layer below. So effectively we can heal on this empty layer and keep our background completely untouched. Now let's zoom in a little closer to our image here, and a really useful keyboard shortcut for zooming, if we hold Command or Control, that's Command on a Mac, Control on a PC, if we hold that and the space bar, and then we can click and drag to zoom in. If we drag to the right, we zoom in. If we drag to the left, we zoom out. And notice wherever I click, we kind of zoom in over that point in the image. So this is really useful for retouching because we can just quickly zoom in and out of different areas of the face like this. And let's have a look over the forehead over here. Now when we're zoomed in close, we can also hold the space bar and drag to move around our image, which is another useful shortcut. Then when we release those keys, we're back to our spot healing brush tool. Now a third useful shortcut, when you're using a brush based tool like the spot healing brush tool, you can use the left and right square bracket keys on your keyboard to make your brush tip either larger or smaller. So I'm using the left square bracket now to make a small brush tip, and then all I have to do is start painting with the spot healing brush tool, and notice how it does a very good job of removing these little marks and blemishes on the skin here. Now the spot healing brush tool excels at this because it kind of samples the nearby pixels to decide what you want to remove. So it's useful for skin because it can just sample from the clean areas of skin nearby to get rid of these little marks or spots around the face that we want to remove. And it does a very good job of this. So we can just paint over these little marks and lines around the face like this. And again, I can hold the space bar and drag to move around the image. And let's just finish off down at the bottom here. And if I toggle that layer off and on, you can see the difference a few little clicks can make. And just to give you an idea of where I've painted, I can turn off my background layer here by clicking the eye to turn off the visibility of that layer. And you can see all these little marks are where I've painted with my spot healing brush tool. So effectively, we've added in these areas on top of our original image to retouch those parts of the face. We can also do the same here with these stray hairs and lines. And if we go into the hair here, there are lots of stray hairs that are kind of quite distracting. That's because our portrait here is backlit by the sun. So the sun from behind is picking up and highlighting all of these little flyaway hairs around the image. And what we'd really like to do is get rid of some of them. So you can see occasionally the tool does slip up. It's not perfect, but most of the time it does a pretty good job of filling in those hairs with background details like this. When the pixels are kind of cluttered and complicated, that's when the tool does slip up a bit more, but if that happens, you just need to undo and try again, or you could indeed switch to another retouching tool like the clone tool. So I'm just going to carry on using the spot healing brush tool to tidy up some of these stray hairs, and I'll pause the video and come back to you when I've finished this job. So here you can see after a few more minutes retouching with the spot healing brush tool, I've managed to get rid of a lot of those more distracting hairs around the edge of the head here. And if I toggle that layer off and on, you can see the difference that makes. Again, I'll hide the background layer, and that shows you exactly where I've healed. Now I'm going to make another new layer, and I'm going to use this to apply some cloning. So I'm going to grab the clone tool from the tools panel over here. And again, we can go to the tool options at the top here and make sure it's set to sample all layers. Again, so that means my layer here will sample from those 2 layers below. So we can set this layer to be called cloning. And the clone tool is a very simple tool. It lets you clone pixels from one place to another. The way it works, if we hold Alt and sample a source point, so I can hold Alt and sample this area here, and then we click on that, and then we can paint elsewhere in the image, and you can see that allows us to clone pixels from one place to another. I'm just going to undo that, because what I'm going to use it for in this instance is as a retouching tool to soften parts of the skin. To do this, I can set a low opacity for my clone tool. So I'm going to bring the opacity down here to about 20% in the tool opacity options at the top here, and then I can hold Alt and sample a clean area of the cheek here, and I'm going to use it to just soften these little bag areas under the eye. So I'm going to hold Alt and sample the cheek below the eye. And again, I can use the left and right square bracket keys to resize my brush tip, and I'll just swipe over that area under the eye a couple of times to soften it. Again, with the other eye, I can hold Alt to sample the area on the cheek underneath, and then just swipe a couple of times to tone down that area. Now, if I toggle my cloning layer off and on, you can see the difference that that makes to my image. Of course, because we're working on a separate layer here, we have complete control over the strength of the effect. If we think it's too strong, and in this case I think it probably is slightly too strong, what we can do is lower the opacity of that layer by using the opacity slider here in the layers panel. So I'm going to drag that down to about 70%. And then if I toggle it off and on again, you can see it's more subtle now. We could even go slightly lower, around about 60, 65%, somewhere around about there. Again, toggle it off and on, and it just softens that area very slightly, but keeps it looking natural, which is the key when retouching a portrait like this. Now, another thing we might want to do with portraits is lift the eyes, because the eyes are one of the most important features of any portrait, and we can do this with some subtle tonal adjustments. Now, I can use the adjustment layer icon here at the bottom of the layers panel to add an adjustment layer. And adjustment layers work by affecting all of the layers below them in the layer stack. So I can click the create adjustment layer icon here, and I'll go for a curves adjustment layer. And notice how we get a new layer appearing in our layers panel here called curves 1, and we also get the properties panel pop up with our curves adjustment within it. And I can drag this curve line down to darken the image or up to lighten the image. So I'll drag it to about there. I think I can always tweak this afterwards. And then I'm going to hide my properties panel for now, and I'm going to go to my adjustment layer here in the layers panel, and notice there's this big white box attached to my curves adjustment, and this white box represents my entire image. It's a mask thumbnail here, and because it's entirely white, that means that the adjustment is completely visible across all parts of my image. In fact, if we zoom out to full screen, you can see how that adjustment affects my whole image. But what we can do is change this box here. If we make it completely black, then our entire adjustment is going to be hidden behind a layer mask. So to change it to black, all I need to do here is invert it with a keyboard shortcut. I can use the keyboard shortcut Command or Control and I. That's Command I on a Mac, Control I on a PC, and that will invert that layer mask, so now it's completely black. And when we're talking layer masks, black hides and white reveals. So with that layer mask thumbnail still active there, what I can do now is zoom in closer to the eyes here, again using Command or Control and the spacebar and dragging right to zoom in. Then I can grab the brush tool. If I set my foreground color to white down here, I can hit D to do that. Then I can start painting to selectively reveal the effect of my curves adjustment layer. So I can start painting over the eyes, again using the keyboard shortcut, the left and right square bracket keys to resize my brush tip. All I need to do is start painting over the eyes here to reveal that lightening effect. So this gives us a local adjustment just in the areas that we want. So I can just paint over this eye as well to lift it in the same way. And of course, because we're using an adjustment layer, our effect is completely editable. So we can double click the curves icon here on the adjustment layer to go back to my properties panel, and I can tweak that curves adjustment. You can see now it's just affecting the area we painted over the eyes here. So we could perhaps add a point there and then maybe add a second point so that we're only really lightening the highlights in that adjustment. So I'm going to bring that to around about there. If I toggle that adjustment off and on, you can see the difference that makes to the eyes. Again, it's probably slightly too strong, so of course we can always go back to our opacity slider here and knock down the opacity to reduce the strength of the effect. And I'm pretty happy with that. But I'd also like to boost the iris now. So I'm going to add a second curves adjustment layer. Again, we'll click the create adjustment layer icon here at the bottom of the layers panel and choose curves. And this time with my adjustment, I'm going to make an S-shaped curve like this by dragging one point up near the top part of the line and a second point down near the bottom part. And this will just create more contrast and punch and saturation in my image. So I'm going to bring it to around about there. I think I can add a third point in the middle to tweak the shape of my S. Again, I'll hide the effect behind a layer mask with that keyboard shortcut Command or Control and I to invert the mask to black. And again, I can paint with white to selectively reveal it just in the areas that I want. So I'll grab the brush tool, again set my foreground color to white, and I can just paint over the iris here, and that allows me to reveal the effect in that area. And the same with this iris here. And again, I can toggle that layer off and on, and you can see how that just allows me to boost the tones within the iris. Now let's zoom out a little and see how we're looking. I think that's looking pretty good. I think perhaps, again, the effect over the eyes is slightly too strong. We always want to keep this subtle, so I'm just going to knock back the opacity of my brightening layer there, and also that top layer there. We'll lower that slightly to around about there. If we toggle both of those off and on, and that's looking nice and subtle now. Next, what I'd like to do is soften the skin a little bit. I think because a flash was used for this image, if we zoom in close, there are these little highlights over the skin here, and I could do with softening those a little bit, I think. So what I'm going to do is make a merged copy of all of my layers here using the keyboard shortcut Command or Control, Shift, Alt and E. That's Command on a Mac, Control on PC, plus Shift, Alt and E, and that will create a merged copy of all of those layers below, and I can rename it merged here. So basically this gives me everything that we can see on those layers below in a single layer now called merged. Then what I can do is use this layer to apply my skin softening effect. And we're going to use a filter for this. So I'm going to go to Filter, we'll go to Other, and we'll go to High Pass. Now the high pass filter works by converting most of our image to grey here, but it gives us a control over frequency, so we can see just the fine details within the image, and we can use the radius slider to control the details. So I'm going to bring the radius to about 9 for this, and then hit OK. Then what I need to do is invert the tones on my layer here. And again, I can use that same keyboard shortcut as we used for our layer masks on the layers below. That's Command or Control and I, and that inverts the tones on that layer. So now you can see the detail has changed slightly. Then what I need to do to give me my lovely softening effect is change the blend mode of my layer. So I'm going to go to the blend mode drop down here at the top of the layers panel, and I'm going to choose the overlay blend mode, which will effectively hide all the grey areas to give me my lovely skin softening effect. If I toggle that layer off and on, you can see the difference that that makes. Now, of course, it's softening everything, which is not what we want. We just want to soften the skin. So as with our two curves layers here, we can use a layer mask to selectively control the parts of the layer that are visible or hidden. So to do this, I can go to my layer mask thumbnail here and click it to add a white mask, and then to make things easier for myself, I'm going to invert that mask to black with Command or Control and I again to hide the effect completely. Then what I need to do, of course, is grab my brush tool as before, set my foreground color to white and start painting to reveal the softening effect over the areas of skin. So I'm going to paint over the forehead here, and notice how that gives me that softening effect around that area, along the nose here, and then under the eyes like this, on the cheeks and around to the chin. And with that done, what I can do is toggle that layer off and on. And you can see the difference that makes. In fact, if we zoom in a little closer, again, we'll toggle it off and on, and that's our skin softening effect. And again, of course, it's slightly too strong, but we can lower the opacity of our skin softening layer to tone down the effect to somewhere around about 60%, I think. Again, I'll toggle it off and on, and that's nice and subtle, and I think that's looking much better. So that's our finished retouched portrait. Let's take a quick look back through our layers here. So if I hold Alt and click the eye icon here, this will give me a view of my original background image here. So that was our original portrait here. Then what we did was used a spot healing brush layer here to remove some of the stray hairs and blemishes. We used a cloning layer to soften the bags under the eyes, a couple of curves adjustment layers to boost the eyes, and finally a skin softening layer on top. And that's my finished retouched portrait. So once I'm done, I can choose to save my image by going to File, Save As, and I can save it either as a Photoshop document, which means that all of my layers will be preserved, or I can choose to save it as a TIFF, and again that will preserve all of my layers as well. Or alternatively, I could save as a JPEG to give me a flattened, compressed version of my image. So we could perhaps choose to save it as a Photoshop document and as a JPEG if we wanted to share it with others or post it online or something like that. So there we have it. That's how to retouch your portraits using a combination of Photoshop tools, adjustment layers, and filter effects.